Depending on where you are, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. But wherever you are, welcome to the second in the 2023-2024 African Literature Association lecture series. Thank you all for being here. Thank you too to Matt Brown and to Lexi Langendorf for help setting up the technical side of things. Again, apologies for being a little bit delayed here. And a special thanks, obviously, to our two highly eminent guests, Professors Lindfors and Emenyonu. Really lucky to have two absolute giants of the ALA with us here today. Both of them are Professor Emeritus at their respective institutions, Bernth Lindfors from the University of Texas at Austin, and Professor Ernest Emenyonu from the University of Michigan-Flint. Professor Linforce was one of the key players in the establishment of the ALA and hosted the association's first conference way back in 1975 in Austin. And both men have been stalwarts of the association. Professor Emenu coming to the conference from Africa for many years before himself moving back to the US here. Both scholars have had an absolutely huge impact on African literary studies, not just through their individual scholarship and as teachers, but as institution builders, both in the United States and in Nigeria, and as field-defining publishers and editors. Professor Lindfors established research in African literatures in 1970, developing that journal into the venerable quarterly publication that we all know, and editing it for the first 2 decades of its existence until 1989. Professor Emenyonu, meanwhile, took over the editing of African Literature Today, which was first published even earlier than RAL in 1968. And Emenyonu took over the editorship of that journal in 2000. I couldn't possibly list all of these scholars' publications and achievements in a brief introduction such as this one. So suffice it to say that Professor Lindfors's bibliographical research output has been prodigious, and his biographical research into figures like the 19th century actor Ira Aldridge has been highly original and expanded the range of African literary scholarship. Professor Emenyonu's work on pioneer Nigerian anglophone writers such as Chinua Achebe and Cyprian Ekwensi has been similarly significant in defining the shape of African literature and criticism. It's truly an honor to be introducing these two great figures in African literary studies. Today's lecture is going to take us back to the early days of the ALA, when the political liberation of the African continent was still incomplete. International relations were distorted by the Cold War, and debates over political ideology, particularly racial politics, could set even close friends and allies against each other. Professor Lindfors will go ahead and read his paper, and once he's done, Professor Emenyonu will respond. After that, we will move to a moderated discussion of the two presentations based on questions that I invite everyone watching and listening to put in the chat function of the YouTube channel. One of the great advantages of this chat function is that audience members can put comments and questions in the chat as the speakers are speaking without obviously interrupting them. So if something occurs to you as Professor Emenyonu and Professor Lindfors are talking, please just do put that in the chat. Lexi will be monitoring that and passing those comments on to me, and we can use those for the moderated discussion. So thank you again, Professor Lindfors and Professor Emenyonu, for being here today. Welcome once more to the 2023-2024 ALA lecture series. And I am going to mute myself, and Professor Emenyonu, if you can mute yourself and close your video down too, then the floor, Professor Lindfors, will be yours. Thank you.
Am I on? Hello, thanks for this opportunity. This is a paper I wrote a few years ago as part of a contribution to a festival for Peter Nazareth, one of the ALA's former presidents. It raises some issues about the African Literature Association. The African Literature Association was founded as an academic organization open to all. The first draft of its constitution formulated in Austin at the end of its inaugural conference in the spring of 1975 stated that it welcomes membership from all countries. This language was retained in a revision of the Constitution proposed 4.5 years later in the fall of 1979 and ratified at the annual conference held at the University of Florida at Gainesville in the spring of 1980. There was still some dissatisfaction with the text of this revision, so an amended revision was passed unanimously the following year at the conference held at Claremont, which specified that the ALA was open to scholars, teachers, and writers from every country, and welcomes the participation of all who produce the subject of our study and hopes for a constructive interaction between scholars and artists. However, at the business meeting at Claremont, Dennis Brutus, reporting on deliberations of the Issues Committee, read and proposed as a resolution for ALA endorsement a measure earlier ratified by the United Nations, calling for cultural, academic, and other boycotts of South Africa as part of the international campaign against apartheid. This meant terminating all links to South Africa, including any collaboration or exchanges with South Africans, as well as any cooperation with them in research programs. In other words, put simply, the ALA would no longer be an academic organization open to all. South Africans were to be excluded. But this applied in practice only to those still living in their homeland. It was assumed, but never explicitly stated, that South Africans living in exile would be exempt from this boycott. Before reviewing the lively controversy this resolution provoked at that time, it may be instructive to recall a similar incident that occurred just before the ALA was founded in 1974-75. Dennis Brutus was then serving as a visiting professor of English and ethnic studies at the University of Texas at Austin, a year in which two South African poets, Oswald Mchali and Mongani Wale Sorote, happened to be in the United States studying at Columbia University. This being the case, Dennis envisioned inviting them, as well as other South African professors and poets currently teaching in the United States, namely Eskia Mphahlele, Kerapetse Kosisile, Cosmo Peterse, Mazizi Kunene, and Dan Kunene to come to Austin in the spring to participate in a poetry reading on the anniversary of Sharpeville. He received encouragement from the chairman of the university's African and Afro-American Studies and Research Center to do so and proceeded to phone them. The budget for this event was small, so he could offer to pay only their local expenses, no promise of an honorarium. But this did not matter. All of them were enthusiastic about coming and participating as a group. Then something happened that changed his plan dramatically. In the middle of the fall, 7 or 8 University of Texas faculty and graduate students traveled to Chicago in my VW bus to attend the African Studies Association conference, where we held a public meeting to discuss the possibility of forming an African Literature Association in Austin on the weekend of Sharpeville. This was approved by everyone in attendance, and we returned to Austin excitedly exchanging ideas on how to proceed. Instead of merely hosting a poetry reading, we decided to ask the College of Liberal Arts to sponsor a larger event that would bring more writers and scholars to campus for a weekend of discussions and festivities, still focusing primarily on South Africa, but now also involving participants from other parts of Africa as well. The Dean of Liberal Arts agreed to fund such a symposium on Black South African literature with input from representatives of other nations as part of the proceedings. It was not difficult to persuade writers from West and East Africa who were based in the United States to join us, and our final program included such names as Chinua Achebe, Emmanuel Obiechina, Romana Segudu, Palandu, Baidu Jefo, Kofi Owunor, Ama Ataidu, Peter Nazareth, and Ali Mazrui, all of whom spoke as respondents to the keynote addresses given by the South Africans. We also allowed plenty of time for participation from the audience at each session. Dennis, meanwhile, was trying to round up extra funding from foundations, enabling us to invite additional writers from the African continent. He was especially interested in enlisting a few white and colored writers from South Africa in the proceedings. These initiatives failed, and when we learned that Nadine Gordimer would be visiting the United States in March, Dennis asked me to write her to see if she would be available. I did so on January 15th, and she cabled her acceptance as soon as she received my letter 10 days later. She expressed an interest in participating in this Sharpeville commemoration by reading a portion of her latest novel, The Conservationist, which was about to be published on March 11th. This is when things began to go awry. In a letter I subsequently wrote to Gordimer explaining what happened, I said, quote, "There are no local objections to your appearance on the program, either as a speaker or reader of poetry, until after we received a phone call from one of the South African featured speakers, who indicated that he and other featured speakers would be unwilling to share the same platform with you or any other white South African. Dennis called the other featured speakers who were in the United States to verify this statement. Most of them agreed with the position, but there was some difference of opinion. For example, one said he'd be willing to share the platform with any white South African, even the Prime Minister. Another said he would even object to white South Africans sitting in the audience and listening to the discussions. The spectrum of opinions was rather wide, but at least 3 of the 5 writers consulted were ready to pull out, or perhaps walk out, if you or any other white South African writer were to participate. Dennis had earlier written to Gordimer claiming that at the working committee meeting, he had spoken strongly in favor of the principle that the ALA should be open to all, but admitting that he had called for the withdrawal of her invitation to the symposium because he thought it would be consistent with what he had said to his fellow South Africans in order to allay their dissatisfactions and anxieties. In her reply, Gordimer was quick to point out that these 2 principles were contradictory, making it seem unlikely that you will succeed easily in separating racism from plain color discrimination. Your counsel has not withdrawn the invitation because I am a white racialist, but simply because I am white. Therefore, my color has remained the operating factor. I don't know how we get around that one. This contretemps was never mentioned at the symposium or at the poetry reading commemorating Sharpeville, and not one of the 5 white South Africans present was harassed or prevented from speaking from the floor. Even before the Claremont meeting, there were a number of South Africans who continued to participate in our conferences. A case in point was Richard Reeve, who was invited by Emil Snyder to appear as a keynoter at Bloomington in 1979. One of the highlights of that meeting was reported to be Reeve's spellbinding autobiographical speech delivered at the conference dinner. After he learned of the boycott measure adopted at Claremont, Reeve wrote to me asking, quote, "Is it true that the ALA resolution against South African writers involves Blacks as well? Does that mean that I can no longer be a member since I am a collaborator back home?" Parentheses, shades of ridiculousness. However, there seems to be confusion here. I'm quite in favor of writers like Stephen Gray, who could not care a stuff about his fellow writers and is squeezing everything he can out of the system as a white, being blackballed. But how on earth can Black writers who are having a tough time be ostracized? In response, I told Reeve I don't know how or even whether the new ALA resolution will be enforced at future meetings. I can't imagine that anyone would object if someone like Fatima Dike, who attended last year's meeting in Claremont and spoke out against the resolution, or yourself were to attend and participate. In other words, it may function more as a white ball rather than a black ball. Although there may be a few exiles who would claim that any South African, whatever you, who was given a passport by the South African government, would not be sufficiently opposed to the system to be allowed to speak. In fact, at subsequent conferences, we never learned from the self-appointed censorship committee, composed entirely of South African members in exile, whom they chose to exclude from participation. Perhaps they actually seldom intervened, relying on future conference conveners to do the necessary discriminatory work for them. Another possible explanation is that scholars in South Africa knew they would not be welcome at ALA meetings and decided to stay away. Before Claremont, the ALA averaged about 6 paid-up members residing in South Africa annually. By 1984, there were only 2 remaining. And meanwhile, debates within the ALA were getting nastier. In March of 1985, Nancy Schmidt wrote to President Peter Nazareth, resigning her position on the ALA's executive committee because, quote, this year's meeting was the culmination of 11 years of intensifying politicization of the ALA by a minority of members who wish to pursue political goals which are not related to the study of literature. Every year, we are faced with attempts to censure opposing views, unquote. Ex-President Emil Snyder echoed this concern in the pages of the ALA newsletter when he stated that, I see nothing wrong in the linking of politics with literature during our annual meetings, only insofar as the politics of our opinions do not silence the voices of different and even of dissenting opinions, unquote. I added to the discussion by suggesting that the, quote, ALA repudiate any political posture that impedes scholarship. I believe that the ALA ought to be open to anyone who wishes to join it, and that members attending annual meetings ought to have the right to hear opinions from any corner of the globe. Anything else amounts to discrimination and censorship, evils that lie at the very heart of apartheid and other oppressive, coercive social structures that support human freedom. I also believe there should be no boundaries placed on scholarly research. There should be no subjects, no ideas, no territories that are off limits to the researcher. Anything else restricts freedom of inquiry and predisposes the researcher to bias and error. Further, I believe that a scholar should have the right to say what he thinks to any audience without fear of prosecution, intimidation, insult, or injury. Anything else is intellectual slavery, a condition in which the first and foremost freedom, that is freedom of speech, is extinguished, unquote. There were many others who contributed to the discussion of the ALA on its 10th anniversary, though no action was ever taken to change the ALA's boycott policy. Then, in August 1986, I received another letter from Richard Reeve announcing that he had been appointed as a visiting professor at Harvard for the spring semester of 1987, and wondering if there might be any conferences he could attend while he was in the United States. He said, quote, I am not sure how welcome South Africans who choose to remain on in South Africa and fight from within are at the ALA. I was led to believe not very welcome. But if we are, and it falls within that period, I would love to attend. I told him, quote, I believe that there should be no objection to your attending the ALA conference at Cornell University in April. But if you wish to participate by reading a paper, that would have to be cleared by the executive committee, which is currently headed by Cecil Abrams at Bishop's University, Lennoxville, Quebec, Canada. I cannot predict how the committee might respond to such a petition. They would probably ask you to provide evidence of your opposition to apartheid and then vote on the matter. If you wish to subject yourself to this type of vetting, write to Cecil. Reeves' response was brief, quote, "There is no chance whatsoever that I shall submit my anti-apartheid record for scrutiny by those who are not part of this physical struggle," unquote. 2 months later, I heard from him again, this time with an interesting story to tell. Quote, "On Monday, I received a phone call from a lady at Cornell, that is Ann Adams, who seemed to be the convener or top executive, who told me about the conference, hummed and hawed, and then said that Miriam Tlali had been invited as the keynote speaker, was on plenty of panels, and had to address schools in the Cornell area. She wasn't coming. The Cornell lady, I think, had only just learned that I was in the country, only just. Could I stand in? My approach was cautious. She admitted she had not yet consulted anyone and was doing it on her own initiative. I reminded her of the crazy resolution about South Africans not in exile and advised her to consult her executive and then come back to me. She said she would phone that evening. She phoned back an hour later, most embarrassed. She must have phoned Pittsburgh or Canada, where Brutus and Abrams were teaching. What she, in fact, was doing was disinviting me, shades of Nadine Gordimer. She herself mentioned that the situation was bizarre, unquote. But bizarre as it was, this was evidence of the kind of control exerted by a few individuals, indeed, perhaps only one person, who happened to be on the censorship committee. On this issue, he spoke for the entire membership of the ALA as a whole. There appears to have been no consultation with anyone else, not even other members of the committee. Perhaps every member of that self-ordained committee had this power single-handedly to blackball anyone in South Africa. And this had the blessing of the ALA as a valid and effective contribution to ending apartheid in South Africa. In 1994, when South Africa eventually completed its transition to full democracy, the ALA no longer needed a boycott policy. And as more South Africans started to turn up at our meetings, presumably with no interference from members of the censorship committee, we began to learn much more about what South Africans were writing, as well as what they had produced during the period we could not hear directly from or about them. There were a number of memorable moments in this new era of openness. One of the most significant was the keynote address given by Albie Sachs at the Charleston meeting in 2013. We also were able to mount a successful conference in Johannesburg and increase our membership in South Africa as a consequence. One hopes the ALA will never again make the mistake of forming a censorship committee. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lindfors. It's given us a lot of food for thought. I'm going to move straight on to invite Professor Emenionu to give us his paper in response to what you've just delivered for us. Thank you again to you, Professor Lindfors, and Prof. Emenionu, please unmute yourself and turn your video on, and the floor will be yours.
Mm-hmm. Is that my video?
Looks like you're just about there. Yes, thank you. Great.
Can I begin now?
Yes, please begin.
Right. Thank you very much. The African Literature Association was founded in 1975, as Bernth mentioned. And the controversy we are focusing on in this lecture is essentially about how apartheid in South Africa affected the focus of African literature at that time. I would like us to examine the state of African literature before 1975. It would appear that the African literature had for decades earlier faced complex challenges and controversies before the formation of African Literature Association. Early controversies and debates on African literature had centered on its definition. What is African literature? Who qualifies as an African writer? Following traditions elsewhere, this should not have been problematic. Defining French literature, Australian literature, Chinese literature, American literature, followed a pattern that made each of these literatures homogeneous, more or less. Not so with African literature. What is African literature? Who was the African writer? The issue of oral literature was not there yet, nor was feminism. The early voices were dominated by men of different nationalities and tongues. At the time the African Literature Association was founded, there were but few female voices. Nawal El-Saadawi of Egypt, Flora Nwapa of Nigeria, Mabel Shegun of Nigeria, Grace Ogot of Kenya, Bessie Head of Botswana, Amata Aidu of Ghana, to mention but a few. The Makerere Conference of 1962 spent a long time over whether Europeans who had been in Africa long enough and wrote about their experiences from a colonial perspective could be said to be African writers and their works African literature. Think about Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Joyce Carey's Mr. Johnson. They were the African classics then. The debated and disputed issues were diverse and uncoordinated. An umbrella was needed to cover all of these complex features. In existence then was ACLAS, the Association of Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies. Australia, Canada, India, etc., and other countries under the British Commonwealth came under that umbrella. It was not the model to follow. Disciplines such as history did not face as much problem as African literature and won the battle to incorporate oral traditions. With African literature, one dealt with nationality and linguistic and language issues on broader and more complicated dimensions. Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone, indigenous African tongues. Chinua Achebe's intervention at the Makerere Conference in Uganda comes into focus at this time. It was Achebe who said, "You cannot cram African literature into a small, neat definition. I do not see African literature as one unit, but as a group of associated units. In fact, the sum total of all the national and ethnic literatures of Africa. An attempt to define African literature in terms which overlook the complexities of the African scene and the material of time is doomed to failure." After the elimination of white rule shall have been completed, the single most important fact in Africa in the second half of the 20th century will appear to be the rise of individual nation states. I believe that African literature will follow the same pattern. Of course, you may group them together on the basis of anything you choose, the color of their skin, of their hair, for instance, or you may group them on the basis of the language they will speak or the religion of their fathers. Those would be all valid distractions, but they could not begin to account fully for each individual person carrying, as it were, his own little lodestar of genes. The formation of African literature in 1975 provided an umbrella to discuss, debate, establish a kind of united voice to sort out boundaries, include or exclude individual entities. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart came just in time in 1958 to provide a strong voice that characterized the works that followed it as protest literature. Hanneman Publishers in England stepped in as a leading publisher, appointed Chinua Achebe as the head of a series known as the African Writers Series, with the responsibility of selecting what to publish in the series. So I would say that Achebe set the tone for the protests at the time, and there were consequences. Indeed, very little was known about African literature as a literary discipline prior to the publication of Things Fall Apart in 1958. Although Things Fall Apart was later to become a classic, not only in Africa, but throughout the English-speaking world, initial reactions towards it from the Western world were in some places skeptical, in others bluntly negative. Some readers or reviewers of the novel derided Chinua Achebe for attacking colonialism while wearing European clothes and enjoying other forms of Western civilization. Nevertheless, Things Fall Apart was an open threat to centuries of entrenched European fantasies and distortions of African reality, symbolized by, as I mentioned before, African classics such as Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Joyce Carey's Mr. Johnson. What was it that angered European readers of Things Fall Apart at that time? There were African novels before Things Fall Apart that were harsh towards European occupations of Africa. However, Achebe, unlike any other writer before him, dared to look the colonial overlord in the face and called him a thief and a murderer, and got away with it. We're close to the end of the novel, chapter 20 specifically. Achebe wrote, "The white man is very clever. He came quietly and peaceably with his religion. We were amused at, in my emphasis, his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one." My emphasis again, he has put a knife on the things that held us together, and we have fallen apart. We tend to underestimate the full impact of the publication of Things Fall Apart on the British and European literature and literary tradition at the time. Elsewhere, I have pointed out that Achebe became the first African writer who consciously reached into the past, the notorious Heart of Darkness, to draw themes and narrative techniques from the African art of storytelling. His characters had names with meanings that reflected their cultural history and the circumstances of their birth. He brought into the novel realities of Igbo and African environments, human conditions, and sensibilities in ramifications never before thought possible in a novel. They include such realities in Africa, they include such realities as African cosmologies, religious and philosophical beliefs in the supernatural, the concept of death as a point of transition, not a finality, reincarnation, sacrifice, ancestors, and yes, there was coming and going, between the living and the dead. Achebe boldly asserted that there is nothing disgraceful about the African weather, that the pine tree is a fit subject for poetry. One can perhaps see how these ideas could seem audacious and inflammatory in the face of European ideas about literature, its scope and function. And then, of course, E.M. Foster's definition of the novel, documented in his celebrated book, Aspects of the Novel, published in 1927. Obviously, Achebe must have read it while pursuing his Bachelor of Arts degree at the University College London, campus situated in Nigeria, 3 decades after E.M. Foster's book. Yet Achebe unapologetically, purposefully brought into his Things Fall Apart more aspects than Foster did, some inconceivable in European minds. Fantasy, prophecy, human nature, articulated by Foster, were incompatible with Achebe's relative depictions in Things Fall Apart. These include ancestors from the spirit world changing into physical humans to attend social events in the world of the living, the existential roles of diviners, and the institution of the oracle of the hills and the caves. Then the half-human, half-spiritual identity of Priestess Chielo, shopping with fellow women in the open markets in the day, and communing with spiritual agencies at night. And for medium, Achebe brought in the proverb as a palm oil with which words were eaten. Instead of ideologies known in European literatures, Achebe called on African writers to tell the African story the African way. Last but not the least, Chinua Achebe told the whole literary world that the European immemorial concept of art for art's sake was, quoting him, dog shit. He defined the African medium and content of African imaginative creativity in the second half of the 20th century. During the apartheid era in South Africa, the world fought the regime economically by divesting from South Africa of African businesses, and there were many lucrative ones. Isolated South Africa in sports competitions such as the Olympics, denied South Africans, Black and white, from membership in organizations like the African Literature Association. South Africa, in return, denied many artists, writers, musicians, academicians who were opponents of apartheid from living and returning to South Africa. An example was a white South African novelist, Alan Paton, author of Cry the Beloved Country, who could not travel out to receive awards and then be allowed to re-enter South Africa. The United Nations resolution called for cultural, academic, and other boycotts of South Africa as part of the international campaign against apartheid. This included collaboration or exchanges of research programs with South Africans. The African Literature Association knew this. In effect, it meant that its membership was no longer open to all. South Africans were to be excluded, but this applied in practice to those still living in their homeland. It was assumed, but never explicitly stated, that South Africans living in exile would be exempt from this boycott. Was it correct to assume, as ALA was led to believe, that Black South Africans who did not or could not go into exile were collaborators with the apartheid regime and its organs of oppression? Were some Black and colored South African African writers, gladiators, and others victims. Perhaps I should mention here that shortly after the inauguration of the African Literature Association, I vacated my position as tenured associate professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder, returned to Nigeria, and spent the last half of the decade at a college of education, and thereafter relocated in 1980 August to a university, the University of Calabar. I did two major things on arrival. First, as chair of the Department of English Language and Literature, with the unanimous support of my committed colleagues, we changed the name of the department to Department of English and Literary Studies, and refocused the curriculum of the Literary Studies to African-centered curriculum, which predominantly meant study of African literature, study of African American literature, and study of Caribbean literature. In the first 2 years, our students studied British, American, and other world literatures. From the third year, they studied African and African diaspora literature. In their final year, they picked one of the three for specialization and chose from that a topic for their thesis. To complement this, we founded a conference similar to the African Literature Association in the United States. This conference was called the University of Calabar International Conference on African Literature and the English Language, acronym ICALEL. Good conferences could energize freedom of expression and become pragmatic instruments for empowerment. The purpose of ICALEL was essentially to create a platform for conversations between the writers and their audiences, between writers and their fellow writers, between writers and teachers of their works, and between writers and their critics. The most exciting feature was always when writers responded to critics, to their critics face to face, payback time. This was during the apartheid era, but two South African writers were invited as keynote speakers at different times. The legendary poet, activist, Ernest Emenyonu, living in exile, came. In his speech, he focused on the dynamic efforts of South African writers living in exile to combat apartheid. He gave a most touching account of his life at the Robben Island and read graphic poems on his experiences there. Bessie Head, the author of A Question of Power, came to the conference from Botswana in Southern Africa in 1982. In place of an issue-oriented keynote, she gave a most passionate and intimate story of her life with the title, Biographical Notes, A Search for Historical Continuity and Roots. She said that her appearance at the conference was the first time she was invited to address a forum in an African university. Sadly, it turned out to be her last because she died 4 years later. When she finished her speech, she was in tears, and so were more than half the audience in the auditorium. One thing was clear to the huge audiences that listened to the agonies narrated by both Dennis Brutus and Bessie Head, namely, the Black South African, no matter his or her location anywhere in the world, was a victim. Other outspoken voices at the conference, which held between 1980 and 1990, made powerful statements. The first keynote speaker at the conference was Amata Aido, who regrettably passed on this year. The African literature today will be carrying a full tribute on Amata Aido in the next issue, volume 42. But Amata Aido, came to that, in her keynote address. She took the topic, chose the topic on welcome pearls and decorative slaves, or glimpses of women as writers and characters in contemporary African literature. Also at the conference, in 1982, Ngugi made his historic declaration as keynote speaker that he had ceased writing fiction in the English language and that he had started writing stories for children in the Gikuyu language. He had written 3 at that time. He declared that by writing these books for children in an indigenous Kenyan language, he was trying to restore the Kenyan child to his environment. I recall the Mau Mau emergencies. He called on African writers to consider writing in African languages in order to perpetuate in language, in order not to perpetuate in language the new colonial tradition already evident in economic and political spheres. It was after that conference that he was forced into exile by the Kenyan government. It was in the same conference, that Zulu Shofola gave a keynote address titled "The Bogey of African Writers, Language Limitations, and the Creative Process, the Core of the Matter." I began at that time to hear about feminism. Cyprian Ekwensi, for instance, at that conference, in the year he came, and invariably most of them came every year. Ekwensi called on African writers and publishers to enthusiastically and creatively promote the production of literature for mass readers. He called for compulsive instead of compulsory reading. When it was Wole Soyinka's turn, he projected new directions for African literary criticism after offering rigorous responses to the attack on his writing by the Triker, Chinwe and Co., who wrote toward the colonization of African literature. Perhaps the most emotional and passionate keynote speech was the one given by Buchi Emecheta when she came. She held the audience spellbound with some intimate details of her fiction, revealing that much of her popular fiction was based on her real-life experiences. She illustrated with her most popular novel, The Joys of Motherhood, which she revealed grew out of a personal family conflict. Her oldest daughter in England wanted to read medicine, but could not pass the qualifying examinations. But she advised her to take to nursing, which was easier. The daughter got angry and exploded. Quote, "You are not the good mother you make people believe you are. It is because I'm a girl. If it were my brother, you would have encouraged him at all costs to pursue medicine. You are terrible. I am going back to my father." She banged whatever was within reach, broke milk bottles, crashed window louvers, and walked out on her mother. Said Buchi, I went upstairs in anger and sat down and wrote without end for 6 weeks. The angrier I was, the faster I wrote. Had I labored in vain, raising this girl from age 6? Is this my lot as a mother who sacrificed everything to raise her children? The title of the manuscript was originally The Sorrows of Motherhood. Buchi Emenyonu revealed also that the character conscripted in the army in the novel was in reality her biological father. Many publications came out of this of the conference. The Heinemann publishers published, we studied a series in Calabar called Calabar Studies in African Literature. And at the same time that Heinemann in England was publishing African Writers series, Heinemann in Nigeria was publishing Calabar Studies in African Literature. Controversies and debates of issues as they emerge from time to time have helped to enrich the African Literature Association's positions on issues like commitment, inclusivity, accommodation, diversity, inter and intra-continental connections and affiliations. Each issue has given and continues to give the African Literature Association room for growth and expansion instead of shrinking. Achebe summed up this responsibility in an interview with Carlo Owerri in 1981. He said, I think teaching of literature should go on and even increase, because I think it is very important. When we talk about the confusion in our culture, about no morals and so on, where do we get these things in the modern world, if not from literature? I mean, we don't have the social institutions that we had in the past, in which the values of the community were transmitted. How do we transmit a national culture to Nigerians, if not through the works of imagination? This is something that our people have not paid attention to. We are talking about modernization, industrialization, and so on. But we do not realize that we cannot even industrialize unless we have tackled the mind, the imagination, and thus the attitude of people to themselves, their society, to work, and so on. How do you think these things, if you cannot, these things, if you cannot get, how can you achieve these things if you cannot get to the people's minds, to their imagination? So literature, he emphasized, is not a luxury for us in Africa. It is a life and death affair, because we are fashioning a new person. The Nigerian is a new person. How do we get to his mind? Is it by preaching to him once in a while by the leaders? No. I think it's something solid and permanent that we must put into his consciousness. That is what he reads, what he believes, and what he loves. We must dramatize his predicament so that he can see the choices and choose right. This time in South Africa, apartheid has come and gone, or has it? The African Literature Association has known different types of controversies about African literature since its inception. I'm not sure that this is the history you wanted retold. Perhaps the African Literature Association should learn from it and review its constitution at the same time that the association considers its roles and modes of participation in African struggles inside the African continent. It might be worthwhile also to rethink the nature and conditions of member partnerships and affiliations with institutions and colleagues in Africa. Is there a kind of unconscious economic apartheid at the moment whereby African-based participants are being priced out of the annual conferences? I know that controversies, debates, and other issues can continue to strengthen the African Literature Association as it reconsiders the contents of its constitution that brought about this particular controversy in the 70s, and move on from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Emenu and Professor Lindfors. You've given us a great deal to chew on there in terms of questions of inclusion and exclusion. We've already got some questions in the chat, indeed, from current ALA President Joy Urezi, who is interested in finding out from Professor Linforce, and I think from Professor Emenionu too, whether there are any best practices that you can think of that we might use in order to avoid the mistakes that you both summarized. And I also note that Paramita Roy was commenting on what Professor Emonyonu was talking about as economic apartheid, with people not being able to access the African Literature Association. So basically, are there any best practices that you can think of that would allow us to avoid these mistakes? And Bernth, if you would like to unmute yourself and turn your video on as well, we can see both people. And Professor Emonyonu, if you can just tilt your screen a little bit forward, we can actually see more of your face. And keep it coming down a bit further. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right. But anyway, there's the question to you both. And please, Professor Lindfors, if you would rejoin us by unmuting video and audio. There we go. You need to unmute the audio, Bernth.
Pressing the button.
That's better. Oh, no, now you've gone the other way. You've muted yourself again. Please unmute, Bernth.
Well, okay, is it working now?
Yes, you're on. We can hear you. Yes.
Hear me? Okay. The question was about best practices. What can the ALA do?
Yes.
All right. How does one become a member of the ALA? There's a transaction involved. You pay dues, you pay a fee. If you want to participate in a conference, you also have to pay fees for the conference. Now, as has been pointed out, this is a burden, especially for people who want to participate coming from Africa, where there are problems with obtaining the appropriate amounts, the currencies, and other infrastructural problems. But the transaction exists. The transaction ensures that any member also has certain privileges. The person can participate in conferences, because they've paid a fee, because they've joined the association. I don't know how we get around that, although the association made an effort in recent years to cancel fees for scholars coming from Africa on a competitive basis. I think especially graduate students can apply to join the association and participate in the conferences without paying any fees at all. I think that's a positive development, but it would be very difficult to maintain that for hundreds of people who might like to attend our conferences without the financial obligations that it entails. Anyway, one could perhaps expand that program beyond its limits. I think we only allow 3 participants from Africa to get through the gate without paying anything. But we may need a more rational basis for choosing such individuals and expanding the opportunities as far as we can without crippling the organization.
Thank you. Prof. Emenu, have you got any additional suggestions?
Right. One or two, just a little addition to the issue of fees, membership fees. It's okay to have fees, but it's, and then registration fees too. But people coming from Africa, I mean, for instance, if membership dues come to $50 or $100, and the registration fees to $175, these two combined actually total to a full professor's 1 month's salary income. So that is something to look at. LF did something some years ago. It sort of, to agree, it started to, he said it would hold the conferences, its annual conference, maybe once every 5 years on the continent of Africa. That can help. It was said that, when the conference was held in Johannesburg, it really boosted the memberships and then the dues. If you go to a place like Nigeria, with more than 137 universities, and then you host this conference just once, can you imagine the number of people who will become members, even if they were paying in their local currency? And then secondly, I did the African Literature Today, and the price of each volume is at least $100. There used to be an African edition, paperback, which existed because somebody, a family in England, had donated something from the estate of their family. I think, 3 years ago, that stopped. So right now, there is no African edition of African Literature Today. And so like the association, African Literature Today is about African literature, and it should really be within the reach of African scholars. When I was appointed editor, and I requested that there must be an African edition, not more than cost, at an affordable price, not more than at that time 1,000 naira. That also has stopped. Now, the African Literature Today now costs about $100. That in Nigeria is thousands and thousands and thousands. It's in fact the amount of somebody's monthly income or several months. So maybe it's a request that some form of funding can emerge to have the African edition in paperback continued. African libraries don't even get the copies of this journal anymore. So these are, but these are some things that are coming in. I'm just bringing out so that the ALA can then see what it can do, but be cognizant of the fact that these problems do exist.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously, what we're doing today, using online technology, we actually have guests here from all over the United States, plus the UK and India and the continent of Africa. So one of the things that we can do that really gets around the issue of cost, although it doesn't get around the issue of access necessarily, because you have to have power, you have to have computers, but it can certainly limit the cost that might be involved in accessing a panel such as this. But there's a comment from Moradewin Adejunmobi. She says, with the benefit of hindsight, the ALA should never again have a censorship committee. The larger question is that of the ALA and responses to political issues affecting Africans. African writers often hold political positions, but debates continue about the kinds of matters about which a professional association like the ALA can embrace on political positions. And actually, I remember in, I think, 1999, Dennis Brutus refused to attend the ALA conference in Morocco because Morocco had a pretty lousy record for human rights and was actually at that point not a member of the OAU as it was. And so he wouldn't countenance going to Morocco. So, but there was never, I don't think, any blanket policy to exclude Moroccan scholars or Moroccan writers. But anyway, I wonder if anybody can comment on any of those comments.
Yeah, let me bring in something there in terms of accommodation or activism. I mentioned earlier that in 1994, I was elected president of Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies. That was the same year. A few months after my election in Sri Lanka, Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed in Nigeria in November. Now, the association, I think it was by a motion made by Canada, decided that Nigeria should be, the headquarters should no longer be in Nigeria, and Nigeria should really literally be expelled. Well, that was the end of ACLAS, not just in Nigeria, but in West Africa. So activism is good, but when it gets to a point where it affects, whenever politics and literature come together, it is literature that suffers.
Yeah, so you seem to be agreeing,
Yes.
Ernest, with the position that Bernth is taking in his paper, that it was kind of ridiculous of the ALA to restrict the access of people like Richard Reeve and Nadine Gordimer in the 70s and 80s. Bernth, do you have a comment?
Well, just to get to the issue of making the ALA more affordable for everyone, we experimented with the idea of having conferences by Zoom during the pandemic, and that enabled people to participate without any cost whatsoever. And that may be a direction we should consider as an option for holding conferences. The conferences are wonderful because you get to see all your old friends and associates, and you have very lively interactions with them. But with a conference, you could at least democratize it to the extent of making it available online without financial penalties to anyone involved. That might be a partial solution.
Except,
yeah, I mean,
except that you will also have to consider how many people can afford laptops. Even. And then in a place in many African countries, and I can say with certainty my own country, Nigeria, the day you start the Zoom, there might be no power supply. So these are some of the things, but I know that that's even better than not having any connections at all.
Yeah. No, there are certain things beyond the power of the ALA, right? We can't guarantee power supply or access to the web, but it does strike me as a potentially valuable tool for us to do and to really create more community and to create partnerships with associations on the continent, for instance. I think that would be a good idea. There's another question here from Joy Urezi, specifically for Bernth. Would you say that ALA in the 1970s silenced some voices in the name of fighting apartheid?
Yes, obviously Richard Reeves is an example of that. And the fact that the ALA was unwelcoming to South Africans who might have wished to participate was a way of choking off any kind of interaction with them. And I think it's a pity. I think it's wonderful, you know, the ALA has an issues committee, and it's occasionally issued disapprovals of injustice in different parts of the continent. And they should continue with that kind of activity. But I think it penalizes the association to prevent or inhibit people from other parts of the world to contribute to the dialogue.
Yeah. As a matter of information, Bernth, do you know whether Zika Mphahlele was ever a member of the ALA? He who went into exile outside of South Africa and spent time in Nigeria, but then went back to South Africa. Was he ever a part of the ALA? Did he get invited at any point?
Who was the person?
Ezekiel Mphahlele?
Well, he went back to South Africa, and I think he had no intention of participating in the ALA.
Uh-huh.
I think he wanted to address his own people, and he offended a lot of South African exiles by going back because they felt he had to collaborate in some way with the South African regime, even by allowing his presence in the country. But I think because he wanted to speak more directly to his own people, he wanted to be back in South Africa. And that's a choice a writer can make. He has the freedom to do that.
Let me add something there, because Ezekiel Mphahlele was also at the University of Denver in Colorado. You know, in fact, I knew him and we worked together. He lived. It was quite frustrating for him to distance himself from the base. After he wrote the Wanderers, he really made up his mind to go back to South Africa, and he did. He didn't want, really, as Bernth mentioned, he didn't want to be part of, be in African legislation. Although recently, James Gibbs had also indicated some other things that may have forced Mphahlele to go back at the time he did.
Yeah. But it would have been, sounds like it would have been ALA policy actually not to invite him once he'd gone back, which does seem kind of ridiculous. There's a comment here from Neville Chunu. He says, I don't agree with Ben that it was about censorship. It was a way of giving Black South Africans a voice over the Patons and other white voices. BLM matters in South Africa. Further, it can be argued that I've lost the place. It can be argued that the exiled community was sometimes out of touch with grass struggles in South Africa during the 70s, such as the UDF.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the argument that the ALA somehow was involved in inviting Alan Paton or someone of that stature. Certainly, Nadine Gordimer was invited for the first time when we had an association or the formation of association, and she was rejected for the color of her skin. I'm not sure that one would have reacted to Alan Paton in the same way or any other participant, but there were certain local pressures put on the committee in Austin to exert this kind of censorship. I would call it censorship because you're not permitting someone to express ideas freely.
So it is also sort of ironic that, and Neville probably knows this too, that in 1988, when Salman Rushdie had just published Satanic Verses, and the book had been banned in India. This was before the Ayatollah's fatwa against him, which didn't happen till February the next year. But he'd been banned in India because India was worried that it was going to stoke Hindu-Muslim antipathies. And so he'd been invited to come to South Africa for a free speech, a PEN South Africa conference, and Gordon had done the inviting. And then on that occasion, the local folks, such as the UDF that Neville references, said no, they didn't want him because this was going to be offensive to South African Muslims. So Gordon ended up on the other side of the debate in that instance, where she was open to disinviting Salman Rushdie, whereas J.M. Coetzee took the line that you're taking, Bernth, which is the more sort of absolutist, free speech is free speech, anything else is censorship. And there was this great row between Coetzee and Gordimer. So it's a really, really complex sort of situation. Ernest, is a very straightforward question here from Antonia Kalu to you. Is the ALT, African Literature Today, exploring the idea of providing online access to African colleagues, African universities?
I don't know about that for now, but I think it's definitely an issue that I could take up with the publishers in London.
I think it's quite doable if you have a PDF, as long as and you can probably package it with some other group and through EBSCO and stuff like that, and get a subscription. So as long as universities would have subscriptions to an organization like EBSCO, you could probably do that, I suspect. Are there any additional? I see some other questions here. I think this is Neville. Neville's coming back. The point is that white South African voices were not given as much attention. It was Fugard, Gordimer, and Paton. I wondered, Neville, did you mean it was Black South African voices who weren't given as much attention? It's a little, hang on, let me see if I can see that comment more fully. I don't see. There's some chat in the YouTube about conferences online. And Professor Owerri says, if any of you know of a university in Africa willing to submit a proposal to host an upcoming conference, please ask them to email ALA. And Chiji Akoma mentions that there's one already presented by University of Abuja. And Joy is talking about the virtual conferences, saying most conference goers really disliked completely virtual conferences because of the lack of community, which is always confusing. And Maria Ajima asks whether the ALA journal can be issued electronically, aside from the hard copy. So we've got a lot of questions on the same kinds of topics. Yeah,
can I say something?
It's worth noting that the response to the ALA has been the formation of the African Literature Association of Africa, says Nduka Otiono, who's going to be one of our speakers in 2024, the fifth biennial conference is currently underway in Lubumbashi, and that is actually very interesting to me that that's biennial. It seems to me that that might be something that we could figure out collaboration on. If ALA went to a biennial sequence and the African Literature Association of Africa was biennial, and if those were off term, that might be really very interesting, that people could come 1 year to the United States and 1 year to a place in Africa. Might be kind of interesting. I am not seeing further. Daewon is asking about African colleagues' access to JALA through institutional membership. And Maura Daewon says it's the publishers that handle institutional access. So, but that I think is something that we should absolutely consider as we go forward. So I'm not seeing additional questions that are going on. Bernth, I am kind of interested in your comment at one point where you said it was possibly just one person who was running this censorship. Were you just talking about the way things were set up in such a way that an individual, indefinite, could have that kind of role, or were you pointing a particular finger at a particular person at that point?
Well, Ann Adams had been urged by Richard Reeve to contact someone on the censorship committee, see whether he would be permitted to participate. And she came back to him within an hour, having consulted apparently one person. And it may have been Cecil, it may have been Dennis Brutus, who vetoed Richard Reeve's participation. And that was meant that the ALA as an association was defining Richard Reeves as an unacceptable person to participate in anything having to do with the ALA.
Very curious. So there wasn't a very good structure, obviously, in that, because that was certainly anything but democratic.
Well, Ann Adams apparently had forgotten the resolution passed in Claremont, urging the conveners to take actions to prohibit South Africans from participating in the ALA. So she had to be reminded by Reeve himself, because he didn't want to embarrass himself by coming to a conference and then being denied participation. And he didn't want to have to vet himself by submitting his credentials to a committee of exiled South Africans.
I see Neville has come back to us again and says, I don't think we should take an all lives matter here attitude regarding absolute censorship. And I think we'd probably tend to agree with that. But the really curious thing here is that it was in the 80s, it wasn't Gordimer that was being excluded, it was Reeve who was being excluded. And my question to you, Bernth, was whether actually that exclusion would also have happened had Mpashlele wanted to come back from South Africa at that point. And it seems like he also technically would have been covered by that ban. So, that's not a question of Black Lives Mattering versus All Lives Mattering. It's a question of the blanket ban on South African participation in the 1980s, which is very strange.
Well, I think Zeke never would have offered himself as a speaker at one of the ALA conferences. I don't know if he's ever contacted by organizers over time. He certainly went around and spoke on campuses in the United States while he was in America. But I don't think he wanted to have any association with the ALA as an institution.
We've got another, again, it's really fascinating to me to hear all these very institutional kinds of questions, especially with you two as the special guests with all of your amazing institutional history and background. Here's one from Emeka Nwadiora. Are there attempts to encourage the ALA to have a division on writing in African languages.
Like, they have different forms.
Want to have a go at that? I mean, I know we always have, and I've certainly always enjoyed the poetry in African languages. That's nearly always been a feature of the ALA. I would also point out that in terms of inclusion and exclusion, there's been really a strong, I would say, tendency. It's not any rule, but a tendency to deal with the sub-Saharan countries rather than the Arabic-speaking North. And we've now got a North African caucus, but I think that's been, somebody else online might correct me, but I would say that's probably only been within the last 4 or 5 years that caucus has existed. So we do have a kind of problem as far as the language issue is concerned. I don't know if anybody online can shed any light on when Nakala was created, the North African caucus, or when the habit of putting on African language poetry readings was instigated, what kind of status that has. I'll just see if I can monitor the chat in YouTube at the same time as be talking. But Bernth or Ernest, if you've got any comments on any of that, please chime in.
Okay.
Yeah, Moradewan has put in the chat that the ALA has an African language Afrophone caucus, but it just hasn't been very active recently. So that's something that we should probably work on. And Neville is still getting back to us, saying Ben misses the tensions between coloreds and blacks in South Africa at the time, another highly complicating factor. And it mentions that he himself chatted with Richard Reeve, who was concerned about that. Moradewan says the North African caucus was created a few years ago. There are papers on African language texts, in every conference, but obviously those papers are generally given, I would say, in English, maybe in French. Joya is drawing attention to Trakala, which hosts the reading in multiple African languages, poetry normally. Ben, I don't know if you want to comment about the Black African, colored South African issue, and Reeve, whether you think that complicates matters or does it?
Let me go back to the language issue. I think Dan Kunene was often expressing the view that more attention ought to be paid to oral literature. And I think that's a valid objection. It hasn't been a part of our conferences very often, but partly that's the reason. The reason for that is that very few people who have credentials in the area of working in oral literatures are interested in interacting with ALA participants. I'm not sure what inhibits them. They're anthropologists, others who have mastered African languages and could contribute to discussions of those literatures, but they don't seem to be attracted to our organization. And perhaps some effort to recruit them would help to amend that problem.
I'm trying to keep up with the chat here. Antonia Kalu says, from ongoing comments, it looks like the ALA should begin to consider using simultaneous translators during panel presentations. And she anticipates some discussion about costs. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and that's exactly where the objection will come, I'm sure. But what about that, simultaneous translations?
into how many languages?
Yeah. Which languages would you do it to? Yes, it would be very tricky. Let's see. And Moradewin mentions there's an international association of International Society for the Oral Literatures of Africa, which focuses on African oral literature, so separate. And Emeka is saying, I evidenced a non-response to my questions. Let me go back to Emeka's question. Which is this question of having a division on writing in African languages. And Moradewin answered that, saying that there is an African language, an Afrophone caucus, just hasn't been terribly active recently. So Emeka, I hope that answers your question. But if not, please pop something else into the chat. I'm trying to keep track of both YouTube and the Zoom at the moment. It looks like we still got 39 folks watching, which is great. And it's wonderful that they are literally all over the world, which is really quite exciting. And evidence that ALA is perhaps doing the right thing, at least in trying to set these lecture series up in a digital format. Emeka specifically referenced Obi Wali, his Ghost on Writing, and his talking about English being the dead end of African literature. All right, so and he's asking specifically whether you would like to give a response to that, Bernth and Ernest.
Yeah.
Do you think English is the dead end of African literature?
No.
That sounded fairly emphatic.
In fact, at the time Obi Wale, wrote, saying, he was specific that if it wasn't in an African language, then it wasn't African literature. But that couldn't really go that very far, because Chinua Achebe came in and said, look, if you take Nigeria, for instance, if you bring in 6 Nigerians in a room who come from different ethnic groups, if you take away English language, there's no way they could communicate intelligibly. So that's, and it's just like when Googie started by saying, no, if what we're doing writing now is, it's Euro-African literature, because it's in, European languages. And then he came in and said he wasn't going to write in English again. But how long did that take? It's in terms of practicalities, pragmatic answers. How would who would be responsible for these publications? The publishers want to. It's a kind of investment, and indeed, the audience is also important. So no, Obi Wale in his lifetime found out that also that there are certain things that are ideals, but implementing them will be a different issue, altogether.
Yeah. Professor Linforce, what do you think about the Obi Wale line?
Well, I think Chebe answered the question from a point of view that I would agree with. I think, we have some problems with restrictions on people regarding language. And the ALA, for example, hasn't paid much attention to Lusophone African literature in recent years. We used to have a trio of scholars who would present papers at the ALA, but they seem to have disappeared. And it's one of the problems. When we talk of African literature, we're talking in the plural, African literatures. Research on African literatures actually made that point when we first started, that one can define literature in a variety of ways, by language, by ethnicity, by style, whatever you choose. There are different ways of compartmentalizing and discussing literatures. And I think we should be open to all approaches, but it leads to some chaos and confusion when organizations attempt to take on this role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just say that the Lusophone caucus is actually now expanded, and it's Lusophone and Hispanophone, and so there is even now attention to African literature written in Spanish, and I've seen a few articles written about Equatorial Guinea, for instance, with people writing in Spanish. It's also really interesting to me, I think, with the two of you on the line here, in the very earliest days of RAL and ALT, I wonder, is it the case that there were more articles in those early issues of those two journals that dealt with oral literature in African languages than you would typically find today? I mean, has in fact the sort of globalization of culture really pushed us further away from African language literature, do you think?
There is something that one can look at there. How many, let's say, literary scholars in Nigeria, how many of them actually can read and write in their mother tongue? Mm-hmm. So it's not a matter of being theoretical about it. There are many literary scholars today, who are professors in literature, African literature, but who cannot read anything in their mother tongue, let alone write in it. So we shouldn't really be dogmatic in that way. And many of the African writers today, many of them are in the diaspora. Some of them were born in the diaspora. Some of them don't even speak the language, the mother tongue, the language of their parents. So it's really a dilemma, but it's also a very one where you can find a practical. Somebody can talk about a novel, an African novel that's fantastic. Take Things Fall Apart, for instance. It's been translated and counted into 63 languages. The Igbo language, which is Chinua Achebe's mother tongue, the Igbo language doesn't have any acceptable translation. There's a Yoruba, the translation of Things Fall Apart. The one translation in Things Fall Apart that was published before Chinua Achebe died, Chinua Achebe disowned it when he read it, and there was another one that really didn't even make it. So it's important that underscores the necessity for looking at the teaching of African languages in the educational systems of African countries. If you don't, if you don't, raise people who will write and speak the language, I mean, people who speak the language and understand it, how can there be criticism of it or discussion of it?
Thank you. There's one more comment in the chat that we haven't brought up yet from Chris Dunton. Again, getting back to the question of Zika Mpashlele, pointing out that one of the problems with his return to South Africa was his active participation in the apartheid regime's Bantu education system. So one might have imagined that actually exclusion of him would have been based on politics rather than any kind of racial concern or even the national concern, that he was actively working on behalf of the apartheid government, in effect, even though he was talking to his own people and contributing in that way. So these things are really super complex in their multiple dimensions. I am not seeing any completely new questions. Chris, beg your pardon, Chichi Akoma, thank you for mentioning Isola, and also pointing out the recent launch of Ugeba, an academic journal in the Igbo language, but I don't know whether that's specific to literature or not. And again, Antonio Kalu is coming back to you, Prof. Emonyonu, making the point for the ALA to consider simultaneous translators and translations. No matter how hard that would be, but I think it's an interesting idea. Anyway, we've got to about 12:48, so maybe I can just offer Professor Lindfors and Professor Emonyonu one last word, and then we can wrap up for today, and we'll be next back on here in January of 2024. So Professor Lindfors, do you want to say a final word to sum things up?
Okay. Well, on the language issue, I can sympathize with African writers who have lost their mother tongue or the ability to function in their mother tongue. I had the same experience. My mother tongue was Swedish. My family moved to the United States when I was 2.5 years old. So I quickly lost the ability to function in that language. I tried to learn it as a teenager by going out back to Sweden and living with a family over there for a summer. So I can speak a very ungrammatical version of Swedish now, but I wouldn't dare try to write anything in it or even read the language. And I can understand if you're working in English throughout your professional career in Africa, that you may lose the facility you once had in your mother tongue.
Thank you.
I would come in there also and say that it's really a problem. We do want literature in indigenous African languages to thrive. And it's and in fact, if we can have sections in ALA that can look at this, but it will still go back to what's happening with those languages, who are speaking them, who are teaching them. We just the African literature today coming, the volume that's coming out now on November 20th was on African literature in African languages, or African literatures in African languages. There were only 6 articles that really looked at that says something about literature in those in indigenous African languages. So, and we waited and extended and extended and extended, nothing came. So it's really something that will go back to the educational system, the what's taught, the emphasis given in Nigerian African languages, the emphasis, everything now seems to be in English or in French. But it is important. I mean, when when I wrote the book, The Rise of the Igbo Novel, published in 1978 by Oxford University Press, there were only 5 notable novels in Igbo language. But today, I've collected and made studies. There are close to 150 novels in Igbo language. Mm-hmm. So we will still have to come back to teach people the importance of the language, and then they have to get to it before they can read it. People praise novels written on the Nigerian Civil War without even looking at the novels written in Nigerian languages on the Nigerian Civil War. Mm. This is a problem, but it's perhaps something that look at on panels and on African during the African Literature Association conferences and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
but it's just there.
Well, since you're mentioning that, Professor Emenionu, I would remind people that the deadline for getting abstracts in for the 2024 conference, which again is in the USA, is again going to be terribly expensive for folks coming from Africa. I apologize for that. But the deadline for getting the abstracts in is, I think, November the 15th. Please check the africanlit.org website to see how to submit your proposals. And with any luck, some of the conversation that we've had today will actually have prompted some responses. And maybe this conversation will even be cited in the abstracts or the papers that you present in May of 2024. But in the meantime, thank you very much indeed, Professors Lindfors and Emenyonu. This has been a thoroughly stimulating discussion, wonderful papers and terrific comments, rating all sorts of things online.
Can I add one word there?
Go for it.
African Literature Today, volume 42, which is on oral and written African poetry and poetics. The deadline is October 31st. We're still, we might even extend that deadline because not much has come in on African,
4 days.
oral and African poetry and poetics. So please spread the word. We're still open to receive papers.
Right, and completely pertinent to our discussion today and the need to try and foster this scholarship. But thank you both very, very much indeed. The next ALA 2023-2024 lecture will be in January. Please keep an eye out in your email inboxes for announcements of that. And in the meantime, thank you again very, very much indeed, Bernth Lindfors and Ernest Emenyonu. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Where do you do that?
Hello.